Inside of this is a pretty special 17-inch laptop that I just acquired used via our local eBay Germany platform Kleinanzeigen, which is pretty comparable to Craigslist. When this was released 7 years ago, it did cost around $3,500. And I actually still paid $500 for it. Now the crazy thing about this is that it came with Intel Coffee Lake desktop CPUs back in the day. And in this case we're actually having the Intel i7 8700K, a legendary CPU that was the fastest casual consumer CPU of 2017. Now this body is going to be pretty huge according to the images I've seen so far, because besides the beefy desktop CPU it also sports a GTX 1080 mobile. So this beast should actually still be okay for most games, with some exceptions, but even brand new ones. But enough talking, let's unpack this monster because I'm really excited to test it. Some packing material, very nice. I do like it when people that sell used stuff really take care and some time and love to pack and wrap the stuff up so it's safe and sound. Wow, now look at that. I can already tell it's so heavy. That's quite a few kilo. And I mean, that's a huge charger. There's even a case included. Oh my god, that is insane. That's so heavy, that's easily 4 to 5 kilograms. Wow. Okay, let's go. Whew. Look at that. That's insane. It really seems to be in a good condition as it seems. I don't see major scratches besides from this area over here. No scratches on the display, as far as I can tell. Look at the speakers. It says Sound Blaster Pro Gaming, tuned by Sound Blaster Pro Gaming. Even with a fingerprint sensor, look at that. And it has a backlit keyboard, though I think he said that the blue color is not working as good anymore. So what's actually really great about this is the 32 gigabytes of RAM and the fact that it's already providing 2 M.2 slots and 2 SATA slots. You can add 4 drives in this beast and also 4 RAM slots for up to 64 gigabyte. I mean, come on, how freaking awesome is that? And we even get a super handy service hatch to upgrade all of that. At the bottom here, you can easily upgrade the RAM, the SSDs. I'm in love. Okay, now that we gave it a first look, I'm gonna take some time, install apps, drivers and games, and we'll give it a test ride as if it was 2017.
This is Hubwood.
So, quite a few days have passed now, and I've had enough time to take a closer look at this laptop. So far, everything is actually working quite well, although, as is often the case with laptops, not always 100% perfectly. And I'd say, before I'll tell you what this laptop is really capable of overall, let's first take a look at its gaming performance in some more recent games. By the way, I'm considering making an extended video at some point where I test the GTX 1080 mobile in even more games. Let me know in the comments if you'd find that interesting and which games you'd like to see. And now let's get to the benchmarks, which I recorded using an external capture card on a desktop PC, while the laptop was running in performance mode at maximum power and performance and fan speeds.
This game has just been released last week. I actually just included Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 in this test. And guys, this game runs buttery smooth on this laptop. I'm impressed. It's really well optimized. At Full HD with high settings and FSR set quality, I was getting an average of between 60 and 90 FPS, depending on where I was located. I'm sure they'll optimize it even further, but as it stands, it's already running really super well. Smooth, virtually no stutters, and a perfectly flat frame time graph. That's honestly an exception, because nowadays games usually aren't this well optimized at launch. Well, and Indiana Jones and the Great Circle unfortunately doesn't run at all because the game requires a GPU with ray tracing capability, so you can actually play it on modern iGPUs, but not on the GTX 1080 mobile. Surprisingly, however, the benchmarking tool of Wukong Black Myth worked flawlessly. I tested 1080p and medium settings with frame generation enabled and FSR at 75% scaling, which resulted in a solid 77 FPS on average, and even the 1% lows were really good at 64 FPS. I didn't expect that. However, when I ran it at native resolution without FSR and with FG disabled, the frame rate dropped to an average of 36 FPS. The GTX 1080 runs pretty hot at around 80 to 85 or even 90 degrees Celsius, while the CPU stays relatively cool at about 55 to 64 degrees Celsius. But then again, this isn't a CPU heavy game. Next up was Hogwarts Legacy. I tested it at 1080p with medium settings and FSR set to quality. That resulted in an average of 68 FPS. The frame times, as it often is the case on older systems with this game, weren't quite optimal, and the 1% lows were only at 28 FPS. This often happens in Hogwarts Legacy when entering new areas for the first time, turning quickly or moving rapidly. That's called transfer stutter, and that happens a lot with the Unreal Engine. Then it stutters a bit initially, but gets somewhat better over time. Overall, it was still playable, though far from perfect. Also take note of the GPU and CPU utilization, both of which were quite low, meaning the game doesn't seem to be running quite as it should on this system. For CS2, I actually tested 1080p at low settings without FSR. This resulted in around 163 FPS on average in the deathmatch on Dust 2 with 1% lows of 66 FPS. The latter is pretty common in CS2 and the game was still absolutely smooth, just not at over 200 or 300 FPS like on many modern gaming laptops. And once more, both the GPU and the CPU were not fully utilized. But then again, CS2 isn't exactly the most demanding game out there. Avatar: Frontiers of Pandora still looks pretty good even on medium settings with FSR set to balanced. It actually ran fairly okay with an average of around 58 FPS and 1% lows of 35 FPS. I think with even lower settings you could probably achieve a stable 60 FPS. Here the GPU was actually fully utilized, pulling around 160 to 180 watts and running very hot at around 90 degrees Celsius. This caused some throttling of its core clock due to the heat. The entire laptop was drawing around 300 watts from the wall and got really loud. However, the i7 8700K managed to maintain its all-core turbo of 4.3 GHz consistently. Not bad. Small note, one of the previous owners undervolted the CPU by 100 mV via the BIOS, which probably helps a lot in keeping temperatures down and maintaining the boost. All in all, definitely playable, and for a 7-year-old laptop that's actually a pretty solid performance. Alan Wake 2 was practically unplayable on GTX 1080 and 1080 Ti cards at launch, but that has been somewhat improved, though the 1080 mobile is really pushed to its limits here. I tested 1080p with medium settings and FSR on quality, which resulted in average FPS of around 42 to 47, and the 1% lows were, depending on the scenario, acceptable to, well, not great. Sure, it runs better than it did a few months ago, but it's still far from perfect. This is simply due to the age of the GPU, which isn't optimized for this game and has to compensate for missing hardware capabilities with software solutions. In forest scenarios, FPS can even drop to around 40 FPS or sometimes even below that. And finally, a quick round of Fortnite. At 1080p and again medium settings with TSR at 75% in DirectX 12 mode, the game ran well at an average of 142 FPS and still looked quite decent, if you like the art style that is. The 1% lows were at 73 FPS, which isn't perfect, but that's because it was my first match played. Meaning stuttering usually improves a bit over time in a few matches. It felt really good, definitely playable. I think if you're fine with 120 FPS, you could even disable upscaling and get a sharper image. Here it is noticeable that the CPU is highly utilized, gets quite warm, and the i7 8700K might even be bottlenecking the GTX 1080 a little at higher FPS.
And if you're up for it, stick around and I'll tell you a bit about this pretty insane laptop itself. So, this thing is basically an XMG Ultra 17, which was also sold, like in this case, as the Clevo P77-5T-M1 and under other names. Back then, this was certainly one of the fastest laptops available, especially since the GTX 1080 Mobile was by far the fastest laptop GPU at the time. And by the way, there was never a GTX 1080 Ti Mobile. So the only faster options were actually laptops with SLI setups, meaning two GPUs running in tandem. And since the 1080 Mobile was barely slower than its desktop counterpart, this laptop was actually faster than most gaming desktops in circulation at the time of its release. And if I'm not mistaken, you could even install an i9 9900K and an RTX 2080 Mobile in this thing. And that's pretty crazy. The Clevo is also insanely heavy and huge. It weighs a whopping 4.3 kilograms despite being almost entirely made out of plastic. And with 17 inches and fairly thick bezels, it really is a beast. But that does make it super easy to open with one hand. On my unit, the RGB keyboard lighting is very dim and all the blue LEDs seem to be dead. However, typing on this keyboard is still feeling really nice, and the touchpad even has a small fingerprint sensor, though I wish it was a bit larger than what it is. The overall port selection is seriously impressive even by today's standards. It has a total of 6 USB ports, including one Thunderbolt 3 and another USB-C port. Plus, there's a LAN port, an SD card reader, multiple audio jacks, and on the back there's the power connector, HDMI and 2 mini display ports. Literally no wishes left unfulfilled. The service panels at the back are also fantastic. It is super easy to access the internals. You can easily swap out up to 4 storage drives, 2 M.2 and 2 SATA. Additionally, you can see 2 of the 4 RAM slots, and the other 2 are apparently at the underside of the motherboard, which means a lot of tinkering and unscrewing to get to them. The 82 Wh battery is also easily replaceable, though battery life is laughable by today's standards. The battery in this unit is already quite worn out and probably only has around 60% of its capacity left. Since the GTX 1080 is always active, I barely got more than an hour of battery life. Even when plugged in, power consumption is extremely high for a gaming laptop, up to 300 watts, and even at idle it's around 75 watts, though still lower than most gaming PCs, I guess. The screen here is also showing its age, after 7 years. It only reaches about 240 nits, so it's not particularly bright anymore, but for indoor use it's still okay. Color accuracy is actually still decent overall. By the way, this is a Full HD 75Hz display with G-Sync, meaning you can play up to 75 FPS without screen tearing. Even under 75 or 60 FPS, the image remains noticeably smooth and clean. The front-facing speakers here are actually decent, quite loud and enough bass. But at full fan speed, you should definitely consider using a headset nevertheless. And under load, this thing can get really loud, as mentioned earlier, and depending on the game, both the CPU and especially the GPU get pretty hot with around 90 degrees Celsius. However, you can manually adjust the fan speed via the XMG Control Center 2.0, and at idle it's actually pretty quiet. In Cinebench R23, the built-in Intel i7 8700K achieved up to 8,330 points in the multi-core and 1,199 points in the single-core. On modern gaming laptops, these scores are now often between 12,000 and 20,000 and 1,500 to 2,000 points for the single-core. Still, I think the relatively strong desktop CPU is what keeps this thing alive, since laptop CPUs from that era usually only had 4 cores and 8 threads. Newer games clearly benefit from the 6 cores and 12 threads CPU here. By the way, the CPU boost sometimes didn't work properly and I honestly don't know why, but a quick reboot always seemed to fix the issue for me. In PC Mark X, it only managed to score just under 6,000 points despite the fairly fast M.2 system SSD it has installed, which actually reaches around 2.2 to 2.6 GB per second. But I'm not sure it's the original SSD, to be honest. In Firestrike, it scored 17,500 points and in TimeSpy 7,050 points. I definitely had a blast testing this. It's impressive what a now 7-year-old top-tier gaming laptop can still pull off today, even though compatibility issues will likely increase over time. But in my opinion, despite the very high price of around $3,500 back at the time, it was a solid investment that could easily provide 5 to 7 years of gaming enjoyment. And I hope that you enjoyed revisiting this piece of gaming laptop history as much as I did. And that's also all for today. If you liked the video, feel free to leave a like, or better yet, subscribe to the channel. Coming soon, tests of the new Ryzen AI Max Plus Pro 395, the new NVIDIA RTX 5000 series laptop GPUs, and the MSI Claw 8, as soon as I can get my hands on review units, that is. And as I said, let me know if you'd be interested in an extended video with even more games on this laptop. Thanks for watching, see you next time, bye bye and tschüss.